This is my new outdoor table. Got karri decking on the top and jarrah on the base. Let me show you how I made it. So this jarrah will make up the legs and the base frame, so the aprons. It's pretty rough and it's enormous. It's about a 4 meter board by, I think it's 240. Yep, 240 by about 45. So what I need to do is cut this into more manageable sections. I'll rough cut the legs out basically, and maybe some of the apron pieces. So with jarrah being a dark wood, it can be quite difficult to actually see a line if you're drawing it with a regular pencil. I'm going to be using a charcoal white pencil. It's important to get charcoal rather than wax. The charcoal is very easy to see and it also rubs off quite easily. Wax-based pencils, they won't interrupt your finish or anything like that, but they are difficult to see. A white pencil just won't show up all that well, just won't draw particularly well. Because these are rough cuts, something this thick is just fine. I'm going to start with the leg section, so I'm going to mark out 78. Our legs will probably end up being closer to 74, but that gives us a little bit of room to clean it up. And the jointer, thicknesser, any glue misalignment, that sort of thing. Because these boards are pretty wavy, breaking them down to the bandsaw is by far the safest and quickest way. The wood is covered in a layer of dirt. Removing that reduces the extra wear on my jointer. To get the thickness I want, I'll be gluing up the leg segments in pairs. I'm going to glue up 2 pairs at a time, or in a set of clamps, because these are pretty thick and pretty strong, so I'm worried, or I'm concerned about the amount of pressure I can apply evenly, whereas with 4 sets of legs, so that'd be 8 pieces, it may not be able to squeeze all of that out. So because this is going to be outdoor, I will be using Type 1-3. Any exterior grade PVA, that should be Type 1. That's a little bit confusing. Type 2 is water resistant, Type 1 is waterproof, and that's according to the ANSI testing. I'm going to use a ink brayer to roll that on, as that's the easiest way to get good coverage. And this bucket of water is so that I don't forget to clean my brayer. I haven't jointed the edges because these are so rustic and full of charm. There is quite a bit of material to remove, so I figured if I glued them up, I can rough saw them at the bandsaw if I have to, or just go straight to the jointer anyway and clean up both edges at once, save myself a bit of effort. You can see here just how rough the edge is. By jointing the opposite face, I can quickly thickness down the craft. Square one side of the legs, then set your fence to the correct value and put that freshly squared edge up against the stop to cut to length. As is common in gum trees, there are a lot of sap veins that needed filling with black epoxy. So these three boards here are what will make up the apron. I've got, let's see, one jointed edge and one jointed face. Because these are, well, rough as guts, rather than sending them through the table saw, I'm going to send them through the thicknesser. That's because I've got a carbide spiral head thicknesser, so if I cause any damage to the knives, I can rotate those, whereas with the table saw, I would have to replace the blade, which I don't want to do. And the reason for that is this is jarrah, so it's got a high silica content to it. It is harsh on blades, but there's also, this edge here is a good example. I'm not 100% certain what's going on there. It's a little bit of paint. It's probably no nails, they've all kind of come out. But I'm not 100% certain, so I don't want to be damaging my saw blade. I'm not after a particular thickness or width, but probably will take as wide as possible and maybe down to about 30 mil. So I'll get this S4S and then get to my final thickness once I know what I'm dealing with. The joinery for the frame is a little bit chicken and egg. I'm going to go with mortise and tenon, as that makes the most amount of sense for a table. To size the tenon, I really need to know what the mortise is going to be, because I'm doing this by machines. A rule of thumb for tenons is to be between 1/3 and half the thickness of your rail piece. And in this case, that's 28 millimeters, so half of that would be 14 millimeters. I happen to have a 1/2 inch bit, or 12.7 millimeter router bit. So that means I'm a little bit under half, but still above 1/3. So I'm going to use that, then set the dado stack on the table saw appropriately to size the tenons. So I'm going to make a sample tenon first in my leg stock. So I've got that 1/2 inch bit in my router. It's a spiral upcut bit from Freud. It's quite nice actually. And I'm probably going to go to about half the depth. I've marked out on my leg here where I want to place it. I'm going to come in 10 millimeters. So I'm going to have a 10 millimeter reveal, and then that's where all my layout marks are. So the first step is to plunge down at the start and stop point, and then sort of fill in the space in between. So by far the easiest way to cut the tenons on the table saw is using a dado stack. The width of the dado isn't all that important, it's just a little bit wider than a standard curved blade and it'll cut a flat bottom. I happen to have a 1/2 inch stack set up, and using a crosscut sled with a 0 clearance insert makes it, well, very easy to use. You can of course use a miter gauge, but this is much easier, particularly for longer pieces. I've got the blade set to a hair under what I need. And it's best to sneak up on the fit that you need, just cutting away a little bit of the tenon at a time until you get a perfect fit in your mortise. Once I had the height right, it was just a matter of cutting the tenon up to the stop on my crosscut sled, then flipping and doing the other side. The crosscut sled is my preference for this over a miter gauge. With the workpiece riding on the sled, there is 0 friction on the workpiece, which means that even the long stretches can be done this way. Then the shoulders can be cut in the same way. The tenons are square, but the mortises are round. I like to round the ends of the tenons as it is much less work in hardwoods like jarrah. A rasp makes pretty quick work of this. Everything gets a 2mm radius round over. This gives it a super soft touch, but still looks nice and square. The underside of the legs especially get rounded over too, to limit the splintering when dragging the table around. So I've got everything clamped up in a dry fit because I need to measure for some support rails. I've got a piece of jarrah here, I've also got an additional piece of merbau, and these will run about a third marker across like this. This will provide a couple of different things. First, it'll add some rigidity, some further rigidity, and help prevent more racking. Secondly, it will help the side or the long aprons from bowing in or out, as it'll really tie those all together. That's probably less of a concern with this timber, but it is another benefit. And probably the most important benefit for this particular table is with the rail going this way rather than this way, it gives me a lot more screwing surface to screw down the slats that will make up the top. Normally you'd be able to get away with just little clips along the edge of the apron, but for this table I need to screw up because we've got a lot of different slats. So I've got two pieces like this. I need to measure at this end rather than in the middle where they'll go to make sure it pulls everything together or pushes it apart depending on if there is any flex. I'm going to use dominoes to quickly add these into the frame. Obviously you could use any other joinery method like the integral mortise and tenon that I've used on the rest of the frame, or dowels, or probably even pocket holes for what these are providing. So I've cut this to length, and at this end it's right, it's maybe a little bit tight, that's fine. However, in the middle there's probably a good 10mm out there, so as I said, that's the way to do it. So that could be caused by a number of things. The wood could have moved, the clamping pressure could force the sides to go out. So when I glue this up, like so, I'll need to have a clamp going across it. I'm using epoxy for the glue up. 3 key reasons. First of all, it's a marine epoxy, so it's plenty waterproof. Secondly, unlike PVA, which swells the wood fibres, this lubricates so the tenons that were reasonably tight will just slide in. Thirdly, the 206 hardener is the slow setting hardener from West Systems, which gives me a much longer working time than Titebond 3. The epoxy is brushed on using a disposable acid brush, both in the mortises and onto the tenon. The blue tape is there to catch the squeeze out, and the small pieces of tape to identify which rail belongs to which leg. A fairly simple glue up, just heavy, so it was good to have a helper. The finish I'm using is an outdoor oil, similar to decking oil. As such, it just gets slapped on with the excess wiped off after 20 minutes. I don't have to be too careful as it's not a film finish. I'm unsure whether this will hold up over time, but I can always add exterior grade poly over top of it. For the top of the table, we're going to go with a slatted top. So I've picked up this karri decking from Bunnings. This is 135 by 20mm. The advantage of using decking is it's relatively inexpensive, not the best price, but not the worst. It's relatively well surfaced for an outdoor table, and the edges are already rounded over. Because I'm going for a slatted look, that's something that I'd have to do anyway, so it's going to save me a bit of time. I did get them to cut it down at Bunnings, and always ask for a little bit longer than what you actually need. The blades at home centres are never all that well maintained, and the saws are not all that well maintained either, so they may not be square, and the blades certainly aren't sharp, so there's plenty of tear out. So I'm going for a 1800mm tabletop. So this piece is 1900, I'm going to cut it to 1850 on one end and then to 1800 on the other end. I'm using 5mm plastic shims to position the board, then marking out where the board extends to. I can then drill through the rails with a 5mm breadpoint bit to give the screw clearance. On the apron pieces, I need to counterbore with an 8mm bit about halfway, so the screws actually reach the tabletop. For the internal stretchers, they just need to be countersunk. Then everything can be held in place with clamps and exterior grade screws, in this case stainless steel decking screws. So there's still a little bit to do. I'll probably add another coat of finish onto the top. A couple of the screws didn't cinch down quite as tight as I wanted to, so I'll need to address those. And I need to make some chairs. These ones aren't the greatest, they don't match in all that well, but the good news is the grey sides do come off, they're just screwed on, so I should be able to make some matching jarrah armrests for it if I don't go down the bench seat approach. If you'd like to make your own version of this, I do have a set of free plans that I'll have available in the description below. This table comfortably seats 6, but you could get a reasonably comfortable 8 on it as well, depending on your chair choice. If I was to do this again, I'd probably be a bit fussier with the timber selection for the top. As I said, these are decking boards, so they're just not quite as straight as I'd necessarily normally have, but end of the day, it got me a outdoor table very quickly and actually pretty cheap in the end. Thanks for watching.